This is From Both Sides, a spontaneous, free-flowing conversation featuring a dynamic team of women, providing insights into both political and civic events affecting the lives of women throughout Pennsylvania. And now, here's your host.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of From Both Sides. I'm Michelle Saletto, your host. Today we'll be talking with two attorneys who specialize in labor law, discussing key issues for both employers and management, as well as employee issues from hiring to firing, women in the workplace in Pennsylvania. It's a show that women in Pennsylvania will not want to miss. Joining me today to help lead the discussion is my guest co-host, Carol Achel. Carol is the former Secretary of the Commonwealth and former County Commissioner in Chester County. Carol, welcome back.
Thank you, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to tell our audiences.
I think it'll be a very interesting show.
I do too.
Especially comparing what we've kind of been through in the past and what women are really experiencing now.
No pressure.
Okay, let me introduce our guests today. First, we have Catherine Walters. She's a partner in the Saul Ewing Law Firm, specializing in their labor, employment, and employee benefits practice. Catherine, welcome.
Thank you.
And we also have Emily Edmonds. She's a special counsel, also with Saul Ewing Law Firm. She is a labor and employment lawyer with all matters of employment.
Thanks.
I'm glad you're both here, because this is a great topic for women in Pennsylvania, and probably the men who may or may not work with them or employ them. So let's start by asking each of you to tell us just a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your practice.
All right, I'll start. I've been practicing law since 1984. I went to law school at Dickinson School of Law, now Penn State Dickinson School of Law. And excitingly, I also teach there now on Monday evenings. We're doing one of the first practical problem-solving courses. It's an innovative type of course where they bring in outside practitioners to assist brand new law students with simulations. My practice has been almost exclusively on the labor and employment side all of these years, and I am management exclusively, but I do both employment side, which is everything but traditional labor law, and I also handle traditional labor law. I'm one of what you would call a generalist, and a lot of that is because I started in a pure labor and construction law practice where I got my labor chops, and then I merged into other law firms where I began to do more employment counseling. And in Pennsylvania, particularly central Pennsylvania, we don't have as many unionized workforces as we have non-union workforces. So the employment side of the practice really does take probably more of my time than the traditional labor. And some of the aspects of my practice include dealing with a lot of the business side of labor and employment. So I'll do traditional employment agreements, non-compete agreements, separation agreements. I deal with employers or basically businesses who are acquiring or merging companies. So we deal with WARN Act issues. We deal with how to merge a workforce. I also do the opposite of that, which would be considered downsizing. And so that means we analyze the workforce and we look for statistical analysis to make sure that we aren't laying off or terminating a disproportionate number of women or minorities or other protected classifications. And this leads me to the last aspect of my practice that I'd like to mention, and that is I do a lot of affirmative action work. I work with federal government contractors on just about every aspect of labor and employment law and federal contracting work. And it's a very interesting and exciting area of the law even today. So I'm going to stop now and turn it over to Emily.
Okay, thank you, Catherine.
Thanks, Catherine. I am celebrating my 10th year as a lawyer, in fact, next week.
Wow, you look too young to be saying that, but go right ahead.
Thank you. I graduated from Dickinson School of Law, and before that I went to Millersville University for my undergrad. I was an English and journalism major because I thought I wanted to be a journalist, but wasn't quite sure, and took a job as a paralegal right after college. So I did that for a few years and then decided...
that gave you your interest in...
It did. I wasn't sure if I wanted to take on the debt yet. So I got my feet wet, decided that I liked it, and went back to school. And I've been at Saul Ewing now for 10 years. My practice is also focused on employer side employment law issues. I'm also in the litigation department, so I also do general commercial litigation, but my heart is really in employment law. because no 2 days are usually the same when you're dealing with employee issues, because you're dealing with lots of different kinds of personalities. My practice tends to focus on counseling, like you said, from hiring to firing, soup to nuts, all the issues in between, interviewing, making job offers, disciplining employees once they are employed, dealing with leave issues, dealing with pay equity issues, and then every once in a while, of course, a client gets sued, and so I handle the litigation, which is generally focused on discrimination, retaliation, or leave issues, and those in Pennsylvania start at either the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission or the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission federally, and then end up in federal court. And that's where I spend most of my time litigating discrimination and those types of claims.
Okay, great.
Sounds terrific. Sounds very interesting.
It is.
When you talk about discrimination issues, women today in Pennsylvania, what do they need to be aware of? So oftentimes I would think in the past women didn't mention if they thought perhaps they were being treated unfairly. Now if a woman employee thinks that perhaps she is being treated unfairly, what's the procedure?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that women in the workplace should know is try to have a basic primer on what their rights are in the workplace in terms of, the equal pay laws, both federally and on the state level. I know Catherine can fill us in on a little bit more of the detail of those particular laws, as well as what their leave rights are, and that depends on the size of the employer in Pennsylvania. And, also having a good grasp on their employer's employee handbook. A lot of times employees sort of tend to get the employee handbook and sign the acknowledgement and throw it to the side, but there's actually usually some pretty important stuff in there. And so having a grasp on what's in there is also important.
Some other issues would be sexual harassment. Now, we really refer to discriminatory harassment because it applies to all protected classes, race, sex, age, and so forth. But sexual harassment was really the first area of discriminatory harassment that the courts fleshed out. And sexual harassment has become, while we still see quite a bit of it, it's not as prevalent as it was. At least the lawsuits aren't as prevalent as they were in prior years. It's a very good thing for the plaintiffs. No. But ultimately, sexual harassment is an area of the law where employers will start with the kind of training. And so one of the things that we do for our clients with respect to discrimination is to train their workforces, train their supervisors. And really what we always say is a well-educated group of supervisors means not a discrimination-free workforce, but one that's virtually discrimination-free.
Yeah, but it is a tricky situation for women. I mean, I'm glad it's not happening as much. I've seen it happen to women. It's happened to me, where men make advances at the workplace. It's totally inappropriate. It only really happened to me when I was much younger. I think I got enough kind of chutzpah that I, could handle myself. But I still really am concerned about that, especially for young women. And so I'm glad to hear you don't find it happening as much. What kind of issues are you seeing with interviewing? Because interviewing is, and I was a school superintendent and official at the State Department of Education for many years. I used to do trainings on interviewing, helping women interview. What are kind of some of the issues that you're seeing now with interviewing and women? Curious about that.
Well, in essence, most employers that have more than a few employees have taken a great deal of training on what should be part of the interviewing process. So typically there are a raft of questions you're not allowed to answer and a raft of questions or ask. A lot of questions you're allowed to ask, and a lot of the trainings that these employers take would be the do's and don'ts of interviewing. Mm-hmm. However, every so often you'll hear the story about a woman who was asked, "So, do you have any kids?"
Yes,
you're going to have some kids?
I've been asked that.
And we see things like that. Or are you married? I don't see a ring. Maybe we could go have dinner and talk about this job opportunity and so forth. And we see that kind of thing still. But with respect to what women should be aware of when they're being interviewed, as Emily pointed out earlier, they should know their rights. They should know that the employer doesn't have a right to ask them whether they have children or whether they plan to have babies or whether they're planning to get married anytime soon. But the question becomes, what happens when the employer does ask that question?
That's what we need. What
Right?
is an appropriate response for a candidate for employment
When asked an
when asked
inappropriate question.
Right.
That's really difficult, because if you say, you're not allowed to ask me that question, you're
know.
probably not going to get that job.
I know.
But if you answer the question, or you kind of skirt the issue, because nothing requires you to answer an illegal question honestly or dishonestly, if you just try to skirt the issue or say, I have no current plans, or
I haven't decided that yet.
haven't decided that yet, then you wait and see if you got the job. And if you didn't get the job, then, well, we might have some type of a discriminatory issue to pursue for not hiring me. So that's one way of looking at it.
Yeah, the other thing that we've seen, back to your question about the interviewing process, the one thing that we've seen since social media has become so much more prevalent in our society is the use of social media by people who are doing the interviewing of the people that they're interviewing. And we've really started to tell employers that if their staff size allows for it, to try to separate those two functions and really have one person, like a staff person, who does the social media background hunting, and to train that person on what are the appropriate things that they're looking for. You know, that they should report back to you. You know, here's the things that I found out on social media that are valid and relevant to what you need to know about this particular person and what they're putting out there for the world to know, but not necessarily to tell you as the interviewer, you know, what the race of the person is. Sometimes from Facebook page you can tell someone's sexual orientation, whether they have children, or, you know, religious views, things like that.
So this review in terms of an employer from a social media perspective isn't kind of a hit or miss thing. Somebody just happened to see them on Facebook. It is now becoming part of the process. That's interesting to me. I didn't realize that it's becoming an official part of the process. And both employees need to be aware of this as well as employers, because something that you put on there could deter people.
Well,
and legally deter people from hiring you.
The best example is a person that has a public Facebook page. So all their information is out there for the employer to find if they go to look for it, and they have overtly racist or discriminatory information on their Facebook page that maybe the employer might want to know before they hire someone for a particular, you know, position, if they're going to be working with a particular group or just at all.
Yeah, just working at all in your whole business or with customers.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So those are the types of things that employers should be looking for and considering, but not necessarily the demographic of the person that they're hiring.
And people often show poor judgment on their Facebook pages, so whether they are overtly racist or bigoted in some fashion, or whether they are showing themselves doing beer bongs, you know, 24 hours a day, or some other type of behavior, you know, employers may not wish to hire folks that display that type of poor judgment to the effect that they're willing to put it out for the world to see. So we are looking at that stuff, and as Emily pointed out, we often have that function separated from the actual interviewing and hiring function. And if an employer is able to do that in-house, then they are fine doing it themselves. However, if an employer hires a third party or an independent contractor or even a credit reporting agency to do that, then even just for Facebook or hunting on the net, you are subject to the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And so which means that an employer who wants to look at an employee's background, whether that includes a credit check or not, whether it includes a criminal history check or not, whether it includes looking at social media, the fact that they're using a third party to do that hunt and paying them to do that means that we have reporting responsibilities under something called the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And that means that we have to provide disclosures to the employees or to the candidates for employment on the application forms, and they get authorizations from them. So there is fair warning to people that we are hunting for this information, but a lot of folks don't even read.
Okay, I think on that note, we're going to take a break, and we're going to hear from our sponsors. We'll be right back, so stay tuned.
From Both Sides is a production of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy and is made possible by the support of the Pennsylvania Center for Women and Politics at Chatham University, a nonpartisan center devoted to fostering women's public leadership through education, empowerment, and action. The first to focus on women's political involvement in Pennsylvania, the center integrates disciplinary knowledge, civic education, and capacity building, while examining the intersection of women and public policy. From Both Sides is also supported as a public service by Saul Ewing LLP, a law firm with a 100-year tradition of serving the needs of business, government, education, healthcare, technology, and manufacturing in our region. And by the University Center for International Studies, the engine for extending the global reach of the University of Pittsburgh and its students.
From Both Sides is also sponsored by Dr. Wendell Funk, one of Central Pennsylvania's most experienced cosmetic plastic surgeons. Dr. Funk is a leader in new and innovative non-invasive procedures like cool sculpting. His long-term experience with all types of cosmetic surgery, as well as facial injectables, keeps new and repeat patients returning to his practice in Lancaster, York, and Camp Hill. From Both Sides is also sponsored by the Ed and Jeannie Arnold Foundation.
Hi, and welcome back to From Both Sides. We're here today with two legal experts talking about labor law and women in the workplace in Pennsylvania. So, Carol, we just finished up about social media. I think you want to talk a little bit about equal pay for women in Pennsylvania and how that looks.
I think it would be interesting to know your experience with equal pay. A lot of the reports that are issued in the press would indicate that women are underpaid, dramatically underpaid for similar working positions in Pennsylvania. Is that what you found? And I guess the second part of that is, do you see specific job placements that seem to be more problematic than other job placements?
It's an
It's a big question.
It's an interesting question, and I will say from my personal experience, I can't say that I've suffered equal pay issues. I started in a small law firm where none of us were well paid. It's 1984, I made $14,000 a year.
Oh, and that stayed with you, though, didn't it?
That certainly did. But really where that goes is personally, I don't have a poor experience with it, but I do see the issues around me. And I think, as you pointed out, there are a lot of statistics. I think some recent statistics that I read but can't support are that it will take until 2072 for Pennsylvania women to make the same amount per hour as men. And under federal law, it would take until 2058 for them to do that. It's either 2058 and 2072 or something along those lines. But either way, those are the figures I've been seeing. And it has to do with the traditional underpayment to women and minorities, for that matter. But really where it starts is men have been in the workforce longer than women in a large way. And ultimately, over the years, the equal pay laws of both the federal and the state, so Pennsylvania has an equal pay law, and it basically talks about not paying the opposite sex less for performing the same jobs under the same working conditions. Very basic, very weak, very, who cares? It doesn't really apply to much of anything. Under the federal law, we have similar language. It's the same job that requires similar skills, responsibilities, and effort. However, the exclusions for that are you can pay a differential if the job requires merit, if there's a merit component, if there's a seniority component, and if it is other factors other than sex. Okay, and the factors other than sex that most employers rely on are level of education, experience in this specific field, time in a particular job, or time with a particular company, whether you call that seniority or something else.
So there's so much wiggle room.
There is a great deal of wiggle
Employers
room.
can kind of do it and say, there's a basis for this.
Yes, and so basically, the federal law is definitely more, I think, kind to employers because of the wiggle room. Pennsylvania law, as I said, is a very basic law, and it has to be all things equal, and now I'm being rather absolute. And as a result of that, in 2016, we saw two bills introduced in the Pennsylvania legislature trying to change the equal pay law in Pennsylvania. And the Senate bill really tracked the federal bill. It had a few more goodies in it. But the House bill went well beyond anything that the federal law currently provides. That one had not a chance in heck of passing. But both bills died before they got out of committee.
Oh.
We expect to see those bills coming back because equal pay has become a really big issue, not only in Pennsylvania, but nationwide.
And just to add to that, one thing that has been tried in Pennsylvania, although it hasn't worked yet, is an ordinance that was introduced in Philadelphia in January of this year, where the Philadelphia banned employers from asking potential employees about their salary history information unless the employee would voluntarily disclose it, and then ban the employer from making salary determinations based on salary history information if they were able to find it out.
You know, I never could understand that, because I've had jobs that I've accepted, including state jobs, where they said, what did you make before? And I had to not only tell them, but I had to prove it with a pay stub.
Which is why I'm not sure that that's the best answer to solving the pay equity question, because it's such a standard throughout, you know, all employers to help them try to pinpoint what is a fair salary. I guess the idea is that if a woman who has been traditionally underpaid her entire life is applying for a job, and the employer uses her prior underpaid history to make that decision, then it sort of perpetuates the pay equity problem. I think probably a better solution, although I'm not sure how a legislator would make it happen, is to help employers figure out a way to perform pay equity studies. I think that's really the best way. And we counsel employers about how to go about doing that so that they really are voluntarily finding the right pay for their employees in their different jobs.
We do market studies, and then with my affirmative action software, I also do pay equity studies on the software. But another aspect of the refusal to ask, or the inability to ask about salary history, the way around it for employers already is to say, and what are your salary expectations? And that's how I get around that problem. But we're seeing this same type of law being passed through many municipalities around the country, and I know that there has been a proposal under federal law to include it as well, again, against federal contractors. But ultimately, the way to get around that for employers is to simply say, and what are your salary expectations?
Yeah, just to be clear, that law is not currently active in Philadelphia.
Right.
It was supposed to go into effect in May, but one of the chamber groups sued to enjoin it, and it was stayed, and now it's in court, but it's not currently in effect.
But it's not the only one of its kind.
Right.
There are others in the country. Along those lines would be those ban the box laws. You wrote something about that, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. Ban the box. It affects women, but more specifically, it affects minorities and minority women. Ban the box ordinances prohibit an employer from requiring an employee to answer information on the initial application about criminal convictions and arrests.
They don't let them ask that question?
An employer cannot require an employee to basically check the box, which is why it's called ban the box legislation for have you been convicted of a crime.
Wow.
And the theory
Don't we want to
behind
know that?
Well, the theory behind it is that
I wanted to know that when I was a school
No,
superintendent
you get
hiring
to find
people.
that out, but later in the process.
late, and that's the point, that just because you have to check yes to the box that you've had a conviction doesn't mean that you should necessarily be completely screened out from that job, and that the theory is, you know, you can ask that question later on in the process, and then the employee will have to disclose. And at that point, I mean, the law is a little bit redundant because both federal and state law already prohibit an employer from putting up a screen that says we will not hire anyone that has any type of criminal history. That's already the law.
When I was a school superintendent, I was building a school. The architect brought me all these subcontractors that I had to sign off on, and a whole number of them had DUIs, and I said, no. And the architects went crazy. They said, Michelle, a lot of these guys have DUIs. You know, you're going to have to approve these. And I said, not in my school district. I said they can build a Kmart, they can build a hospital, they can build an Acme, but they're not going to build my school. And man, they didn't like it. But I just thought, I don't want somebody that potentially is going to bring alcohol on, and I know I made a judgment, but you know, on a property with teenagers, I'm just not doing it. So
and the law allows
probably
you.
I would be. Oh, did it
The law
allow
allows
me?
you to
Oh,
to
good.
make a business judgment like that.
Okay.
I mean, there's certain situations where you may not want a person who's had a DUI, especially if they're going to be driving or working around kids,
Right.
to be in a situation, especially where if safety could be a concern, but it might not be such an issue for an office janitor cleaning out the office after hours.
Although they, of course, have to pass the background checks with respect to being around children. So.
Yes.
Right, right. Well, tell us a little bit about where we are with family leave for women, and what should women know about that, and what should they expect?
Well, currently Pennsylvania doesn't have its own family leave law, but there are some municipalities who do. I'll start with federal law, which is the Family and Medical Leave Act, and that only applies to employers with 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius. But in Pennsylvania, we don't have a current one that is statewide. However, among various municipalities, we do have requirements for what might be called paid sick and safe leave, sick and safe leave. There are also leave laws applicable to federal contractors regardless of what state they're in.
And the state has a the state employs a family medical leave policy, I believe.
Well, the state has its own policy, but there's
Right.
no state law
I see.
relevant.
I see. Okay.
And then we are looking, of course, in the federal government, we are looking at some potential for paid leave. Currently, the Family and Medical Leave is unpaid leave for up to 12 weeks. Yeah. And then some of the other municipalities also provide lesser quantities of leave. And in some instances, like under New Jersey leave law, they can't credit leave used under the New Jersey law against the FMLA leave and vice versa. So you might actually be able to stack 12 weeks of FMLA leave, then add the New Jersey leave on top of that. Mm-hmm. But in federal, in the Congress right now, there are two bills. There's the Family, all in caps, Family Bill, and then there's the Strong Families Act. And those are two bills that are supposedly going to push forward with some fashion of paid family and medical leave.
And while Pennsylvania isn't there yet, there are some states that are mandating paid family leave
would be fantastic.
for their employees. In New York just did it through an insurance style bank that the employee works up to by being employed. They are entitled to certain pay from a system that's sort of like the way Pennsylvania uses the unemployment system, but certain employees in New York can get paid family leave.
Well, I think I'm going to have to ask you both to come back again sometime because we're running out of time, and I think it was so informative. So I really thank you for sharing your experience and your areas of specialization with us. Thank you, Carol, for being here. I want to thank all of our viewers, and I want to remind everyone, especially the women in Pennsylvania, that there's much more that unites us than divides us. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you'll stay tuned again.